So thank you very much for asking me to talk today about the scientific evidence supporting U equals U. So if we think about the state of the evidence, well, the science is now very, very clear. The data is indisputable, and the virus simply can't be passed on if you're on suppressive antiviral therapy. So although we've known about the impact of antiviral therapy on HIV transmission for a long time, saying that it stops it completely is really new and important. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk you through the scientific evidence underpinning U equals U. And I think it's really important to understand just how robust this evidence is underpinning the U equals U campaign, which I really think is one of the most important campaigns in the history of HIV. So I know that some of the evidence will be familiar to many of you, some of it may not be. But I think it's important that we really understand how robust this evidence is so that we've got complete confidence and can go out and spread the message around U equals U. Next slide. So the first thing I usually do when I give these talks is to remind people who are surprised about U equals U is that HIV transmission, even without a condom and without using antiviral therapy, is generally an uncommon event. So if you look at the type of sex we'd associate most with risk of transmission of HIV, that's receptive anal sex, even without a condom and even without using antiviral therapy, the risk is about 138 per 10,000 condomless sex acts. So all you're doing with antiviral therapy is taking it from the right-hand side of the figure and pushing it right the way down to the left towards no risk. And that's really what the antiviral therapy is doing. Next slide. So we've really had evidence now for about 20 years. So this was one of the first studies, the RACI study. This was in 415 serodifferent heterosexual couples in Uganda. So there was no antiviral therapy being used. But what they saw was this really clear gradient between the risk of transmission to the negative partner and the HIV viral load of the positive partner. So a very strong association both for male to female and female to male transmission. The higher the viral load of the positive partner, the higher the risk of transmission. And in the 51 couples where the HIV positive partner had a viral load less than 1,500 copies, there were 0 transmissions. Next slide. Next slide. So there were other cohort studies followed this RACI cohort. And in 2009, the Swiss group, and Suzaia Ataya and Matthias Egger, they basically did a meta-analysis of 11 cohort studies. So they combined all the data in about 5,000 heterosexual serodifferent couples. And they published this forest plot of summary HIV transmission rates per 100 person years, according to the use of antiviral therapy and the plasma viral load. So what you can see is this 92% reduction in transmission for people who were on antiviral therapy from 5.64 to 0.46 per 100 person years of follow-up. And they calculated this was compatible with 1 transmission per 7,900 sex acts, but this was a lot lower than the Swiss statement. Next slide. And the next slide, sorry. The next slide. And the WHO view at this time was that there was insufficient evidence to formulate guidance on the role of antiviral therapy in HIV prevention, either at the level of the individual or at the population level. Next slide, thanks. So luckily, shortly following that, we got the absolute gold level of evidence in the form of a randomized controlled trial. And this really was a landmark study in the field. The HPTN O052 study, which recruited 1,763 serodifferent couples, so again, 1 positive and 1 negative. The majority of the couples were again heterosexual couples, and they randomized the positive partner to either go on immediate antiviral therapy or to go on delayed antiviral therapy, and that meant waiting until the CD4 count dropped below a predefined threshold. And their primary outcome was a phylogenetically linked transmission event. And using phylogenetics was important. It was really the first time this had been done. Because we know in all the transmission studies, if a negative person becomes positive, it doesn't necessarily mean it's come from their positive partner in the study. So this was incredibly important to show just how robust antiviral therapy was. Next slide. So the study was due to continue till 2015, but in 2011, the Data Safety Monitoring Board recommended that the results of the trial were announced immediately and that everyone in the delayed ART arm was offered immediate antiviral therapy. And this was because the degree of protection for negative partners was so great. So in 2011, they stated that there was a 96% reduction in linked transmissions in the immediate early ART arm compared to the delayed ART arm. Next slide. And they continued this, no, sorry, back one, sorry. Sorry. So what they saw, and they continued the study till 2011, was at the very end of the study, they got a 93% lower risk of linked partner infection than people who were in the delayed ART arm. So you might think that's fantastic, a 93% reduction in transmission. That's a hugely positive preventive tool, but it's not quite U equals U, and that's what people sometimes misunderstand about the O052 study. Next slide, please. And if you can do one more click, thank you. So this is a bit of a complex slide, but I wanted to just look in a bit more detail at the 8 negative partners who became HIV positive when the positive partner was on treatment. So the cases are listed A to H, and if you look in the red box, what you can see on the left of the red box is the number of days between the partner starting antiviral therapy and the negative partner becoming HIV positive. So what you can see is that sometimes the partner became positive even before the positive partner went on ART. It was between -5 days and +4 days. So they were in the first week of the positive partner being an antiviral therapy. And if you look at the far right of that red box, you can see the viral load of the positive partner, and it was not suppressed. So these transmissions happened before the positive partner was suppressed. If you just click on. So if we then look at the lower 4 cases, you can see that these happened many years later after the positive partner had been in treatment. But you can also see, looking at the right of the box, that the partners were failing treatment, and this really reinforces how important it is for U equals U to give people the support they need to stay on treatment and to stay fully suppressed. So in these later 4 cases, positive partners were again not suppressed when the negative partner became positive. Next slide, please. So if we look at these 8 cases in summary, what you can see is the first 4 cases, the positive partner had been on antiviral therapy for less than a week, so the viral load was not suppressed. And then the later 4 cases, the positive partner was unfortunately failing therapy and the viral load was not suppressed. So there was a 100% reduction in transmission if the viral load of the positive partner was less than 200 copies. So U very much equals U in the O052 study. Next slide, please. So you might think that's a randomized controlled trial, that's the highest level of evidence, what more do we need? Surely U equals U. But we thought you probably needed a bit more evidence. U equals U at the time was such a transformative statement, such a landmark statement, that we really wanted the most robust evidence possible to underpin the statement. So we set up the partner studies, and we did that because although we had good evidence from heterosexual couples about the reduced risk of transmission from condomless sex with suppressive ART, very few of the studies had included gay men. So in HBTN O052, only 2% of couples were gay couples. So along with the other studies, there was no direct evidence for anal as opposed to vaginal sex. And we also know that condom use effectively prevents HIV transmission. And in all the transmission studies, couples used condoms. They used them intermittently, but they used condoms. And we really wanted to see what was the preventive role of antiviral therapy on its own without using condoms. And also because in the transmission studies, just because you found no transmissions didn't mean that this was zero. You wanted to get really large studies to be very sure of your estimates of zero. So that's really why we set up the partner study. Next slide, please. So the partner study was what we call an observational study, and it was in 72 centres in Europe, and it was in 2 phases. So the first phase followed gay couples and heterosexual couples, and the second phase followed gay couples only. And the aim of the partner study was to estimate the risk of within-couple transmission of HIV during periods when condoms were not used and the positive partner was on suppressive ART. Next slide, please. And I just would like to give grateful thanks to all the people who participated in our studies to help us answer this really important question, who gave up their time and put their energy into the study, and we are hugely grateful. Next slide, please. So I'm going to spend just, sorry, if you could click on and click on. That's great, thank you. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about the methodology for the study, because I think when we talk about U equals U, we have to understand how robust these studies were and how much thought we put into the methodology of the study, so we were really sure that the results that we got were very accurate. So we only included a couple of years of follow-up in the partner studies, between HIV tests in the negative partners and viral load in the positive partner, if the couples had sex without condoms during that time period. If the negative partner didn't use PEP or PrEP, although we encouraged them to, if they chose not to use it, we included that time period. And we only included it if the viral load of the positive partner was less than 200 copies. And then we reported, as I said, the rate of phylogenetically linked transmissions during eligible follow-up. So if a negative partner became HIV positive, then we obtained HIV1 Pol and N sequences from either plasma or PBMCs, and we did this by Sanger sequencing, complemented by Illumina deep sequencing in a subset. And then we got control sequences so that we could construct our phylogenetic tree. Sorry, if you click on. And again. This enabled us to construct, as you can see on the right of the slide, what we call the phylogenetic tree. And so we got the control sequences, or the 10 closest sequences through blast searches of GeneBank, replicate partner sequences in red, or known transmission pairs in orange. And a seroconversion event, if a negative partner became positive in the partner study, we classed that as a linked transmission if the partner sequences clustered together on a monophyletic branch with high statistical support. And we defined that as a bootstrap value of greater than 0.9 or a posterior probability greater than 0.95, and they had a pairwise genetic distance of less than 0.15 nucleotide substitutions per Pol site. So I know that might seem a bit complex and a bit more detail for people, but it was really to show you how robust the methodology was to underpin the results of our study. So next slide, please. So this is where we got to at the end of partner 1. We'd got 1,238 couple years of follow-up, a third from gay couples. And during that time, couples had sex without condoms 58,000 times, which is a huge amount. And we got 0 phylogenetically linked transmissions to the positive partner. But if we looked at our estimates of 0, and what you can see with the dotted line is for every study that you do, you want to think about how precise your estimate is. And the way you do that is by looking at your confidence around the estimate. So the bottom bar in heterosexual couples in dark blue, the absolute worst case scenario, sorry if you click on, was the upper limit was 1 transmission after 217 years of condomless sex. But because we had less follow-up in gay men, if you click on again, the confidence around this was less. We just didn't have a large enough study by this point to be really sure of the result in gay men. So even though the absolute worst case scenario was you'd have to have condomless sex for 120 years to get the outside possibility of 1 transmission, we didn't see why gay men should have a lower level of evidence than people of heterosexual sex. So we kept going with the study. Next slide, please. And if you click on, and click on again, thanks. So we were quite glad that we did, because when we published the result in JAMA in 2016, it was accompanied by quite a negative, or not a negative, a conservative editorial. And they essentially said, how safe is this? That was the subheading of their editorial. Clinicians need to be clear that even though the risk is small, the risk is not 0, and the actual number is not known, especially for higher risk groups such as gay men. So although we thought that the evidence by this point was really clear, it obviously was going to take a greater degree to convince everyone, so we kept going. Next slide, please. But meanwhile, the evidence just kept coming. So this is the opposites attract study, which was a really nice study from the Kirby Institute in Australia, which was done by Andrew Grulich and Ben Babington. And it was quite a small study, but they got about 12,000 condomless sex acts in gay men when they didn't use PrEP, and again, 0 linked transmissions. So the evidence just kept coming. Next slide, please. Thanks. And then what we hoped was really the final word in this, the final piece of the jigsaw. So I presented in AIDS 2018 the final results of the Partner 2 study. Next slide, please. So this was a real-world study. So by the time we got to the end of Partner 2, we'd almost 1,600 eligible couple years of follow-up just in gay men. And the couples had had sex without condoms 77,000 times during the study, which is a huge amount. And this is a real-life study. You can click on. So 23% of the negative partners were diagnosed with STIs during study follow-up. Click on things. A third had sex with other partners outside the main partnership. And click on. And as I said, almost 77 times the couples had sex without condoms. If you can click on things. And so what we got from the study was that 15 of the initially negative men became HIV positive during the study, but they did not get their infection from their positive partner on antiviral therapy. We had 0 linked transmission. So after 77,000 condomless sex acts, none of the negative partners got HIV from their positive partner on suppressive ART, very much proving, I think, once and for all that U equals U. Next slide, please. So I just want to spend a little bit just talking through the phylogenetic tree so that really everyone understands how robust this is. So of the 15 HIV positive partners, 6 of their seroconverting negative partners had acquired non-B infections, so that obviously did not come from their positive partner. And if you look at the tree on the right, what you can see is the partner controls and transmission controls in red and orange always clustered together with high supports on the same monophyletic branch. But in contrast, the partner sequences in blue do not cluster together. They're very widely separated on the phylogenetic tree. And the median pairwise genetic distance was 0.068, with a genetic distance always greater than 0.04, so they were not linked transmissions. So we're very, very sure that the negative partners did not get their infections from the positive partner on treatment. Next slide, please. So if you remember where we were at the end of Partner 1 for gay men, it would take 120 years of condomless sex, obviously outside somebody's lifespan, but we thought we were just going to get the evidence such that no one could ever query it. Next click, please. So this is where we were, and if you click on, thank you, at the end of Partner 2. So around the estimates of 0 transmission, you would have to, as an absolute worst case scenario, have sex without condoms for 435 years to even have a mathematical possibility of a transmission. So very much U equals U. We think that's it. Next slide, please. So despite all the concerns about potential risks, if we look at the evidence for U equals U, there hasn't been a single verified case in the literature of HIV transmission in the context of completely virally suppressive ART. And by contrast, if you look in the blue bubble, all these large studies, really large studies designed specifically to look for cases of transmission when the positive part was suppressed, and we were absolutely unable to do so. If you click on. So there's 0 evidence that HIV transmission is actually possible with a suppressed viral load. So the science is there, the data is indisputable, the virus simply cannot be passed on if you're on suppressive treatment. Next slide, please. So I think people, because this is quite a new concept, even though the evidence is incredibly robust, people always say to me when I give these talks, yes, but. And some of that was summarised by Trip Gulick. He gave a sort of pro and con session in ID Week in 2018 with the kind of questions that people raise. So I'm just going to go through a few of them, the yes, buts. Next slide, please. Next slide, sorry. Thank you. So the big yes but that I get asked is, yes, but what about genital shedding? So we know that the HIV viral load in semen is strongly correlated with your blood HIV viral load. And we know that men who are on suppressive antiretroviral treatment will intermittently shed HIV RNA, and about 6 to 8% of men will do this, but most of it is at really low level. It's less than 2,500 copies. Next slide, please. And this really nice study from 1995, if you look at the figure on the right, what this looked at was it looked at HIV RNA in seminal plasma, and they actually tried to see if they could culture it. Was this a viable vaccine? So, viable virus, sorry. So if you look at the kind of log levels you were getting between 2 to 3, you're simply unable to culture the virus. You would have to get very high levels in semen before you're able to culture the virus. So what this shows is that low-level HIV RNA in semen that you get in people who are suppressed does not translate into a risk of transmission. And this is because the HIV in semen is either defective, it's not replication competent, or it's just not reaching a concentration required for transmission. And you also see this with the 2 drug regimes, so dolutegravir and 3TC. And we know that the participants in all the transmission studies would have had intermittent shedding. We know it would have happened in partner, even though we didn't look for it. And there were 0 transmissions. So genital shedding, we know it happens. It does not impact on U equals U. It does not impact on the risk of transmission. And I think that's very clear. Next slide, please. So the next question I get asked is, yes, but you're only as good as your last viral load. So we know that U equals U is only easy to apply when people living with HIV have access to testing, effective treatment, viral load monitoring, and support to reach and maintain viral suppression. But in these circumstances, the risk of viral load rebound is incredibly low. So essentially, previous viral load measurements predict future. And this is some UK data, and the rate of rebound was 1% per year in people who had been fully suppressed for a number of years, and most of the rebounds were temporary. So if you are adherent to treatment, you will not rebound to any extent, and it will be the reason that we chose less than 200 copies is so that people could have these intermittent blips that you see and still not have any risk of transmission. So to people who say you're only as good as your last viral load, I would very much say you are as good as your last viral load. If you were suppressed previously and you're adherent, you will be suppressed in the future. If you click on, please. And so partner was real life. We only measured viral loads in partner in many people annually. We didn't measure them every month or every 3 months. And people were adherent, and there were very, very low numbers of couple years of follow-up where people blipped above 50. So it was a real life study. So yes, you are very much as good as your last viral load, and that's not a reason to not believe or to discount U equals U. Next slide, please. So the other question I get asked a lot is, does U equals U apply in the first 6 months in antiviral therapy once you're suppressed in blood? What is this magic number of 6 months? And to me, the real question in early antiviral therapy is, does genital suppression lag behind blood viral load suppression? So this is a really nice study from 2017. And what you can see is they looked at suppression of viral load in blood in the top part of the figure compared to semen in the lower part of the figure. And they looked at 3 different backbones, so elvitegravir, rilpivirine, and darunavir. And what you can see is that in blood and semen, you have the same 2-phase dynamics. So the initial rapid phase and then the slower second phase out to the end of the figure, which is 12 weeks after starting therapy. So what you can see with elvitegravir rilpivirine is it very much mirrors in semen the reduction in blood. So by the time, actually ahead with rilpivirine, is you're actually ahead, you suppress in semen before in blood. But even with dolutegravir that lags slightly behind in semen, by the time you get to 12 weeks and you're suppressed in blood, you're suppressed in semen. So that's really the question. Once you are fully suppressed in blood, you're likely to be suppressed in genital secretions. And I normally say below 50, then U equals U applies. You don't need this magical 6-month figure. Next slide, please. So I hope over the last 20 minutes or so, I've really convinced you about just how robust the science is. The data is indisputable. The virus just can't be passed on, and we need to keep talking about it. And I think the big issue, and the thing that Bruce is so wonderful about, and the U=U campaign, is actually to disseminate this message. So scientists were not that good at getting the message out. So we know U=U transforms the social, sexual, reproductive lives of people living with HIV, dismantles HIV stigma, which has such a negative impact on the mental health of people living with HIV, encourages testing, treatment, staying in care, staying on treatment, and it gives a very strong argument for eliminating universal access to care. But I think, as I said, we're not very good as scientists and clinicians of getting the message out. And there's a lot of evidence now that people living with HIV, their partners, policymakers are just not aware of how successful treatment is in preventing transmission. And if you click on, thanks. And I think that the robustness of the data is really underpinned by CDC. So mid last year, they actually gave an effective estimate in both heterosexual couples and gay men for antiretroviral therapy of 100%. So what they're saying is if you take treatment and you're suppressed, there is a 100% reduction of sexual transmission of HIV. I mean, this is just incredible because it's so hard for science to prove a negative, but we are so comfortable with this that CDC were happy to say it's 100%. And if you click on, and Anthony Fauci, who's ongoing hero of the hour with COVID, he has been very supportive of U=U. He regards it as the foundation of ending the epidemic, which is an incredibly important statement for someone like him to say, who's such a leader and a role model in the field. If you can, next slide, please. And click on, thanks. So when we published Partner 2 in the Lancet late last year, we worked with Bruce Richmond and Prevention Access to try and publicise, to try and use the science and to generate publicity about it. And for a couple of days, it saturated the airways, and we hope in some small way we got the message out. But I think we need to keep talking about it. So next slide, please. So thank you very much for listening to my talk. I hope I've managed to convince you, if there was any doubts left in any of you, that science is there, it's indisputable, and people in effective treatment simply cannot pass on the virus. Thank you very much.